go ahead and kick us off then with my usual wonderful joie de vivre. Thank all of you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. You can find us anywhere at Twitter, DNGQC. You can find us on Patreon, DGQC. Every dollar helps, helping us break even. We're starting to do a little bit more and more, and we may end up having to have a little bit of our own tools hosted by a thing. So we're going to maybe doing a little bit more with needing a couple bucks to do that, but we'll see what happens. We've got apparently some big plans, or at least we're sort of discussing them. Today we're going to be going over 2.7, Anti-Oedipus, social repression and psychic repression. It is not a terribly difficult chapter to get through, but I think an incredibly important section, and one that we're going to spend time really making sure everyone has a grasp of. And I'm going to be asking myself lots of questions as we go and making people defend some ideas, because I re-listened to our recap of social repression and our old recording of this, and it's my understanding has come significantly further, and I think a lot of us have had the same happen, so I'm excited to go through that. Any last notes, any last comments before I push us into the book itself?
Yeah, I prepared a epigram for us.
What?
Yeah, a little passage to kick you off. River run past even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by commodious vices of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs.
Thank you. Yes, it's lovely. Good choice. Anything else? Anyone else? Is there another large, wonderful piece that anyone would like to read? That I feel like we should just have a discussion about Finnegan's Wake now. All right, well then I'm going to go ahead and dive in. This is, you can follow along PDF on the screen. I will share inside of the chat right now. If you need to, I've got it up. Otherwise, off we go. We have attempted to analyze the form, the reproduction, the formal cause, the method, and the condition of the Oedipal triangle. But we have postponed the analysis of the real forces, the real causes on which the triangulation depends. The general line of the response is simple. It has been sketched out by Reich. It is social repression, the forces of social repression. This response, however, leaves two problems untouched and makes them even more urgent. On the one hand, the specific relationship between psychic repression and social repression. On the other hand, the particular situation of Oedipus in this social repression-psychic repression system. The two problems are obviously linked, because if psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, it would thereby gain a certain independence and primacy as a condition for constituting a system of exchange or any society, in relation to social repression, which would then concern only the returns of the psychically repressed in a constituted society. Therefore, we should first of all consider the second question. Does psychic repression bear upon the Oedipus complex as an adequate expression of the unconscious? Must we even follow Freud in saying that the Oedipus complex, according to one or the other of its two poles, is either repressed, not without leaving behind traces and returns that will be confronted by the prohibitions, or suppressed, not without being passed on to the children with whom the same story begins all over again? We wonder if Oedipus in fact expresses desire. If Oedipus is desired, then it is indeed on it that psychic repression comes to bear. Now the Freudian argument is of a nature to leave us wondering. Freud quotes a remark by Sir J.G. Fraser, according to which, quote, "The law only forbids men to do what their instincts incline them to do. Instead of assuming, therefore, from the legal prohibition of incest that there is a natural aversion to incest, we ought rather to assume that there is a natural instinct in favor of it." End quote. In other words, if it is prohibited, this is because it is desired. There would be no need to prohibit what is not desired. Once again, it is this confidence in the law, the unawareness of the ruses and the procedures of the law, that leaves us wondering. as we've been seeing in the last handful of sections, Deleuze and Guattari are finally bringing to bear what they've been discussing in terms of their machinic unconscious, the syntheses, the nature of how our desires produced all of these things, to bear on Oedipus, to actually describe and discuss how Oedipus functions within society, within our repression, within how we sort of come to be. This paragraph is the opening of that final bit where they discuss very specifically the nature of the Oedipal prohibition and where it comes from, how laws work. And I would say their note here is essentially that of saying, understand that you have a blind spot, that you have this natural confidence in the law, that, well, of course, if the only things we prohibit are things that are desired, not really realizing the actual things at work here. I love this opening paragraph for this section. Is there questions here? Is there any thoughts or comments that anyone has for this bit? Before I dive in and start breaking apart a couple things I want to make sure we get to. I am happy to sit in awkward silence because I want input.
Thing pops to my mind is it's not even necessarily related to this book as much as like an investigative or critical method that's used in mathematics is when a problem can't be solved. One of the techniques is, instead of like trying to bring more mathematical apparatuses to bear on the problem, is instead to like examine any form of like presupposition for sort of like an arbitrary decision. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari here are doing at the very last sentence of this paragraph. It's the confidence in the law, the unawareness of the ruses and procedure of the law that leaves them wondering whether or not Freud has had or even pulled the wool over his own eyes in this kind of like adherence to the idea that it's forbidden because I desire it.
Yeah, it's an edge they're taking with it, I think, that's unique, where it's almost one step further, where it's, yes, you forbidding it and therefore I desire it. I think they take it almost one further step, where it's by the nature of how you're forbidding it, it is causing desire. That double bind that comes with it is kind of their method here. And it's one of the things that attached me to it I find really interesting. I want to go back because this breaks apart a handful of things they're going to be discussing in this section, and I want to make sure we get to them. The idea of if psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, it would thereby gain a certain independence and primacy as a condition for constituting a system of exchange in any society in relation to social repression, which would then concern only the returns of a psychically repressed in a constituted society. It's a fucking complicated sentence. That they're talking here about the idea that, look, if it turns out that, hey, psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, that there is kind of this nature that we have to suppress things, and as they talk about sort of the two sides of suppression, if this is true that it bears directly on the psychic repression that we experience, then actually the nature of how our society would be formed would actually it would gain this independence, and it would be a condition for constituting a system of exchange. The way for us to sort of how to put it, if Oedipus is a thing that matters to me and is a thing I directly have to repress, then there is by nature, the way that social flows work, as we grow into society, there would be a need for us to discuss social repression. There would be a need for us to have sort of these larger things that are sort of coalescing it and holding it together to allow us to have this repression inside of a constituted society. So that's the first place they start with. And that's the second question then they move to, where they go, well then look, does psychic repression bear upon the Oedipus complex as an adequate expression of the unconscious? Is this the place to start with? Is this the thing that needs to be dealt with first? Does psychic repression bear upon it? This is the question that they're asking. And the difference between repressed and suppressed, in my understanding, is Repressed is happening with social repression. Suppression is when I use psychic repression effectively. The repression is being forcibly pushed in. Suppressed is sort of the healthy response that Freud may say. And Ken, I know you're in the room. I'd love your response. But suppression would be the healthy thing, where I actually place myself correctly in the triangulation of mother-father. I've Oedipalized myself properly. And now, yes, I get to be healthy because I'm suppressed. If it's repressed, that's where shit pokes out the sides and I start having broken stuff happening. It's bad. It's not the best. Is that a close approximation, Ken?
Yeah, I suppose. I'm actually not too clear on suppression. I'm guessing suppression is what people usually think of whenever they think of repression. Because for repression, there was nothing there to begin with, is sort of the weird idea. But yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, and it looks like the only times they really use this is actually in this chapter. Well, they use it a little bit later on, so that works. Yeah, we'll go back. Nope, go back to that page, you stupid thing. Why would you not go back to this page? Of course. Let's make this painful. That's how I see the difference, is kind of the two of those. Anyway, any questions on this? Any last thoughts on this paragraph before we move on?
Yeah, I want to try and expand that a little bit. It's like the two problems, right? If psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, right, it would become a condition for constant a system exchange in society, right? So if there's an incestual prohibition, that becomes a condition for exchange. So like, commodity exchange, business being performed in society. Does psychic repression bear upon the Oedipus complex as an adequate expression of the unconscious? Right, so is Oedipus the object of psychic repression? And if so, is Oedipus then the expression of the unconscious? So there's kind of two things happening there, right? Is psychic repression directed toward Oedipus? And if it is, or maybe to follow that up, right, with a kind of a more direct question, does the unconscious express itself through Oedipus, right? So this last part, when you guys are talking about repression and suppression, I think this is kind of the main difference, right? When they write, so there's two poles of the Oedipus complex, right? It's either repressed, now without leaving behind traces and returns that will be confronted by the prohibitions, or suppressed, now without being passed on to children with whom the same story begins all over. So I think that first part, in terms of repression, that sounds to me like it's focusing on how Oedipus is expressed, right? And this would go back to that second question. Whereas in terms of suppression, it sounds to me like what they're talking about is how Oedipus functions in exchange, right? So this would be that first question.
Bosgard says one is individualistic versus the other being universal, and I think that's a fair also way to say that. Wouldn't you agree, Jack?
Yeah, it's always weird there because the psychic, are we going to focus on a person's psyche, or are we going to expand it to a collective psyche? It gets weird with psychoanalysis there, right? Because this seems to me like they're bearing on, like, this sounds like they're looking at civilization's discontents here, where Oedipus becomes a condition for society, right? We need larger fathers that are going to be our institutions.
Well, and I think that's their critique, is if we have to start from the place that it is determinate for the individual, and it is sort of, let's say, in our nature as people that we have this complex and we need to become properly suppressed or repressed, whatever wording we're using, in order to integrate into society. And society needs to also be triangulated in turn to continue that. All of it's predicated upon this idea of, is the necessity, personally, start with the person. If psychic repression did bear on incestuous desires, if I'm able to do that, it would thereby gain independence and primacy, if that's the case. But then this would be the question. How do you know if it's prohibited, like, that's their question. It is, as they say at the last sentence, it is this confidence in the law, the unawareness of the ruses and procedures of the law that leaves us wondering. The thing I think it's fucking hard to argue with, that the law hardly is about suppressing people's real desires and more about molding people into the way society wants behavior to exist and people to exist. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say, and I think that's their core sort of comment with that.
But you're putting your finger on the question they're asking, right? Because it's sort of like a chicken or the egg here, right? Is Oedipus or is incestuous desire the condition for its change? If so, then how would the law create that condition, right? Because wouldn't it already have to be a condition for the law? Right, so there's kind of there's something there that doesn't quite follow, right?
Yeah, and what it would be drive, the difference between drive sexuality in general and genital sexuality in psychoanalysis. So pairing genital sexuality with incest prohibition and trying to suggest that that is representative of the productions of the unconscious is sort of a moot point. It doesn't really make any sense at all. But if we sort of abstract out of Oedipus and get away from genital sexuality and make it about drive sexuality, where there is a fundamental negativity in the link between knowledge and sexuality, then I think the psychoanalytic point is more coherent, or it's at least more complete, but it lacks internal consistency. Whereas it's sort of nonsensical to make some sort of ad hoc move saying Oedipus is what civilization is predicated on. I mean, that is an ad hoc move. And then make that an a priori. And it just doesn't make sense. But the sexuality thing, I think, can be argued for.
But they almost give it a little bit more credit, right? Because is incest the condition for Oedipus, right? So it's actually I think it's a really square treatment of Oedipus, because they're not conflating the two. And we'll see this throughout chapter 3 particularly, right? Is incest the condition for Oedipus, right?
And it's not, sexuality is.
Right. And so this is really important, because we're seeing how Oedipus, having gone through these paralogisms, right? We know the unconscious doesn't produce Oedipus at this point. So how does Oedipus get produced, right? Is the question they're raising here.
It would be something like language.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, they're going to be answering that, but I think Jack's point is we're only on the first paragraph. Let's give it a few paragraphs here.
Yeah, fellas. I'm sorry. I've been taken away.
I'm going to jump to the next paragraph, because apparently Ken's really chomping at the bit to get to the next entire chapter. So let's jump ahead. The Immortal Father. I do want to mention, if you haven't read Celine's Death on the Installment Plan, also called Death on Credit in English, it is really wonderful and depressing. The Immortal Father of Celine's Death on the Installment Plan cries out, "So you want to see me die, eh? Is that what you want? Speak up." We didn't want anything of the sort, however. We didn't want the train to be daddy or the station mommy. We only wanted peace and innocence, and to be left alone to machine our little machines, desiring production. Of course, pieces from the bodies of the mother and the father are taken up in the connections. Parental appellations crop up in the disjunction of the chain. The parents are there as ordinary stimuli of an indifferent nature that trigger the becomings of adventures, of races, and of continents. But what a bizarre Freudian mania, to relate to Oedipus what overflows it on every side and from all angles, beginning with the hallucination of books and the delirium of apprenticeships, the teacher as father substitute and the book as family romance. Freud couldn't abide a simple humorous remark by Jung to the effect that Oedipus must not really exist, since even the primitive prefers a pretty young woman to his mother or grandmother. If Jung betrayed everything, it was nevertheless not by way of this remark, which can only suggest that the mother functions as a pretty girl as much as pretty girl functions as mother, since the main thing for the primitive or the child is to form and put into motion their desiring machines, to make flows circulate, and to perform breaks in these flows. I do have to say, Jung's joke here is it's a great one. I'm probably getting the fuck canceled out of him these days, but it's a pretty good line. It's a pretty good line. It just is. But it's and their response to it, I think, is pretty fantastic as well. It's like, yes, of course, a man would prefer a pretty young woman, but that's only because the pretty young woman is his mother, and the mother is the pretty young woman. That's the sort of joke, the bizarre Freudian mania that they call, and they're going through here.
Yeah, that's it, because Jung's joke shows us something, but it also can be immediately, right, Oedipus can be immediately recovered just as well, right? And it's supposed to show us something, not necessarily just about Oedipus, right? But we're seeing something particularly about how these paralogisms function, right? We're seeing the global persons called out. We're seeing their functionality called out here.
Yes, and as they say, the caveman or the child, that's the same thing. The primitive or the child, for all they want to do is put into motion their desiring machines. That's it. A great little line. Again, going back to the idea that all we want is our desiring machines. Any questions on this paragraph at all? All right, I will continue to the next paragraph. The law tells us, you will not marry your mother, and you will not kill your father. And we docile subjects say to ourselves, oh, so that's what I wanted. Will it ever be suspected that the law discredits, and has an interest in discrediting and disgracing, the person it presumes to be guilty, the person the law wants to be guilty and wants to be made to feel guilty? One acts as if it were possible to conclude directly from psychic repression the nature of the repressed, and from the prohibition the nature of what is prohibited. There we have a typical paralogism. Yet another, the fourth paralogism that we shall have to call displacement. For what really takes place is that the law prohibits something that is perfectly fictitious in the order of desire or of the instincts, so as to persuade its subjects that they had the intention corresponding to this fiction. This is indeed the only way the law has of getting a grip on intention, of making the unconscious guilty. In short, we are not witness to a system of two terms, where we could conclude from the formal prohibition what is really prohibited. Instead, we have before us a system of three terms, where this conclusion becomes completely illegitimate. Distinctions must be made. The repressing representation which performs this repression, the repressed representative on which the repression actually comes to bear, the displaced represented which gives a falsified apparent image that is meant to trap desire. So we come to the fourth paralogism. Does anyone want to take a crack at it? Go for it, Ben.
I was going to say the repressing representation which performs the repression, the repressed representative on which repression comes to bear, and the displaced represented which traps desire is like a huge idea going forward, right? For the rest of the book, basically.
Yeah, it's significantly important because, again, as much as they talk about Oedipus and we are focusing on it, it's not Oedipus alone. Oedipus is a type of structure that has this functionality. We're talking about representation and prohibition and how social repression ultimately bears upon desire. And that's their last thing here. They go through this. This is the fourth paralogism. The law comes along and says, you can't have a thing. That's all it has to do. Now, all of this is pure representation. It's not, you can't have a thing. I'm not talking about the cookie that the child's reaching for. Like, you can't have that. Nope. And I slap his hand away. No, you don't put your hand in the hot pan. Like, you can't have these things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea of representing a concept. You don't desire your mother. You aren't allowed to fuck your mom. You're not allowed to, what? Oh, well, let me think about that. Let me deal with that representation. And as that gets in, they have their handful of passes this goes through. And if there's anything in this book that I genuinely hate, it's the series of repressing the RRs over and over. It makes this so difficult, like, conceptually to talk about. But
it's sort of like that don't push the button thing, right? Or like you see like those old cartoons where like do not push right over the button, or like if your parents when you're a child tell you like don't open this cabinet, and it's like in a room you never go in anyway, but now it's like a thing. It's like it's not something you wanted until you were told you couldn't do it, and because you're being told you couldn't do it, you're like, oh, I must have.
It's close
wanted
to
to
that.
do that.
It's close to that because
that's what displacement is, right?
Yeah, it's a couple steps, because it's not just as easy as you're not allowed to have sex with your mom, and you go, oh, cool, I want to fuck my mom. Like, it's not like just a twist. Like, there's a process to it, and the big deal here is how the representative, and they call it the displacement, sort of takes place. As they put it, the first is the repressing representation. Now, this is the thing that performs the repression. In this case, we're talking about the Oedipus complex, or the law that actually does it. It's the actual representation that is doing the repressing. Then you have the repressed representative. God, I hate this terminology. We need better words for these things. Can we work on better words for these things? Because I really hate this. The repressed sorry, go ahead.
The repressed representative is like it is what it is, though. It's like the representative of what's being repressed, right? So
yes,
like,
but it's a
what
terrible
other
word.
term?
No, it's just because it sucks to say out loud. That's all. I just hate saying the repressed representative, repressed representation, and like, it's just, there needs to be better stuff. They have so many great little poetic moments, and this is what they went with. That's all. The words are great. I mean, it means what it means. I just hate saying it aloud. Probably sounds better in French. The press representative, like, I can just bet it just sounds better. Anyway, the second part is the repressed representative, on which the repression actually comes to bear. The actual thing that is being repressed, the actual element. And then you have the displaced represented, which is the falsified apparent image. The representation gets displaced. It gets moved from where it actually is, your actual desire, as it exists and as it's being pumped through your desiring machines, as it's making connections, and as it exists sort of triangulated on the BWO and inside of you subjectively. That gets moved, and that moves away. Suddenly it's this other image, and that image is what traps your desire. That representation, these three lines, is like one sentence, is, if there is a singular thing that they're kind of demanding people understand about the book, this is it. This is not against Oedipus. This is against this nature of how desire gets taken in by all of these things. We've had so many talks. Does someone else want to take a crack at this?
Sure. So yeah, we're talking about the fourth paralogism, right? So displacement, and this is what they're getting at with the law, right? With this invocation of displacement, supposing the unconscious has produced a desire for some sort of connection. Here we've got, obviously, with marriage, there's a sexual connotation there, right? The displacement moves, and this is the thing, they're not going too deep into explaining this right here, right? So we don't want to, I think it'll be easier to get into this as we go deeper in, but whatever desire is present, produced by the unconscious, is being displaced, right? So when the subject says, that's what I wanted, they're talking about the third synthesis here, right? So that's what it was in the syllogistic sense, right? In that sense, what they're talking about is for the subject coming into relationship with the law, with the prohibition, right? It affects the syntheses. It affects the unconscious production, but it's not what the unconscious itself has produced. in this sense, it looks like they're even suggesting there's a certain preconscious element here, right? Because now the subject is considering desire, right? Considering the preconscious, particularly here, which I think is part of the displacement. And instead of having been produced by it, it's looking at a certain new production, which is going to take us into this this repression, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe this will help. Desire doesn't have like any single object as produced in the unconscious. Desire desires desire, right? And so a representation sort of fiddles with that and makes it seem as if desire has a single object. But the problem here is that, so say you at one point in time idealize some sort of role or some sort of profession, and you've invested all of your time and energy into this profession, and you're almost there. Like say it's becoming, I don't know, a lawyer or something. And on that day, you feel a tremendous amount of anxiety because now this object that you thought was your desire turns out not to be the thing. What you desired was desire itself, not becoming a lawyer. So now the representation falls and you get anxiety.
And it extends to so many things. Like, again, here we're talking about Oedipus because we're able to spend a lot of time because Oedipus has been really broken down. But grab anything where we have any level of semi-prohibition that seems to lead to other things. Talk about how you're not allowed to do drugs, you're not allowed to smoke reefer, hang out with the black kids, like whatever it is over the last like 300 years. You can start talking about the way that these prohibitions exist. Desire doesn't give a shit. Desire is just desiring. It's wanting to connect and disconnect and see what's around and do stuff. It's a 2-year-old inside of a room that's covered in like all kinds of colorful things. It's always wanting to connect to everything. The moment you've done this and you've said, actually, this is what you're not allowed to do, it's an idea, and it suddenly becomes this secondary thing that inserts itself and traps desire to that visual. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, and it completely breaks. It's yes, Boskerd nails it. We live in a society that is deeply this. We live inside of a place of representation. That's gonna be a big thing later, by the way. So it's understanding that this is not just I want to get to the next couple of paragraphs because, as Jack said, like this is just the first set about it, but we are going to spend time now, the rest of this book, going over this, because when we talk about, and we will, schizoanalysis, for example, it's not about simply tossing in, oh, here's what you don't want, here's where you're unhealthy. It's about figuring out what is with anyone, what are their paralogisms. And with displacement, it's not about saying, oh, cool, you want this thing, you must just want it. It's like, hey, wait, why? What's the things? How's it working? What's your representations? What can I see your representations, sir? Kind of thing, instead of the classic setup. But I'll continue the next paragraph.
Before you do,
okay,
I just wanted to point. This is what I mean about, like, they're going to get into this more directly to explain it, so we'll bookmark it there. But to me, the big thing we want to take from this paragraph is what the law does here, because we saw in the previous sections that the law is a paralogism of command, right? So the unconscious gives commandments, right? Which is kind of an interesting way of phrasing it. But that's very important because what the law is doing here, right? We're talking about how, in a certain sense, what the conditions are of society in this manner, right? And they're using the paralogisms to build this up. You know, we just talked about how the mother and the pretty woman, right, and not in the Julia Roberts sense necessarily, function for the first paralogism. We're seeing how law functions to to be a part of displacement. Honestly, it just creates it. It's caught up in that, right? It has a function within it, and that's very important because it's not the whole story there. And we're seeing this point about the subjectivity, right? The affectivity, the intensity that hits the subject. even when we see this point about intentionality, right? As we were just saying, desire doesn't have intention. This really does sound like we're moving to the pre-conscious and conscious altogether there.
Yeah, and again, we're going to get into this. There's so much to talk about. I would just love to, because this is, again, I think it's super important in the book. But as I just wrote, it's the idea of the desiring that which is forbidden, instead of basically taking on the idea of going, excellent, everyone desires these things, that's why they are forbidden. It's like, no, actually, by making a thing forbidden, here is how it functions, and here's how it changes us. And this is how it changes how our desires work and how representation works within it. It's a great way to sort of break that down. But next paragraph. Such is the nature of Oedipus, the sham image. Repression does not operate through Oedipus, nor is it directed at Oedipus. It is not a question of the return of the repressed. Oedipus is a factitious product of psychic repression. It is only the represented, insofar as it is induced by repression. Repression cannot act without displacing desire, without giving rise to a consequent desire, already all warm for punishment, and without putting this desire in the place of the antecedent desire on which the repression comes to bear in principle or in reality. So that's what that was. Again, I'm actually going to jump to the next paragraph because it was a tiny one.
Because I always write, again, third synthesis.
Yes, it's the whole thing is, again, we exist essentially like the subject exists as a machine to justify its own existence and believe that it exists. So that's me. Oh, that's what that was. Oh, cool. That's my desires. I'm all proud. It's I have in my text, this paragraph ends at the end of the page. Is that accurate for everyone else?
Yeah, so the very bottom 115 with the word grasping.
Excellent, because just asking because it said 119 and I knew that's not right. D.H. Lawrence, who does not struggle against Freud in the name of the rights of the ideal, but who speaks by virtue of the flows of sexuality and the intensities of the unconscious, and who is incensed and bewildered by what Freud is doing when he closets sexuality in the Oedipal nursery, has a foreboding of this operation of displacement and protests it with all his might. No, Oedipus is not a state of desire and the drives. It is an idea, nothing but an idea that repression inspires in us concerning desire. Not even a compromise, but an idea in the service of repression, its propaganda or its propagation. Quote, the incest motive is a logical deduction of the human reason, which has recourse to this last extremity to save itself, which first and foremost is a logical deduction made by the human reason, even if unconsciously made, and secondly is introduced into the affective passional sphere, where it now proceeds to serve as a principle for action. This has nothing to do with the active unconscious, which sparkles, vibrates, travels. We realize that the unconscious contains nothing ideal, nothing in the least conceptual, and hence nothing in the least personal, since personality, like the ego, belongs to the conscious or mental subjective self. So the first analyses are, or should be, so impersonal that the so-called human relations are not involved. The first relationship is neither personal nor biological, a fact which psychoanalysis has not succeeded in grasping. Well, that's kind of an absolutely wonderful summation of that. That's absolutely a wonderful summation of that. Are there any questions on this paragraph before I dive forward? Because I think that was nice and crisp. Again, going over the idea of this is an idea that the desire doesn't give a shit. Like, it's doing what it's doing. The unconscious is doing its thing. And then anything that is personal, and that's really the key phrasing from Lawrence here, anything that is personal, the human relations, the social relations, this isn't part of the unconscious. The unconscious doesn't know Brooks and Jack talk occasionally and that we're doing, like, the unconscious doesn't exist in that place. That's the conscious. That's the ego to Lawrence. Like, The unconscious is there, so the first relationship is neither personal nor biological, and psychoanalysis hasn't made that leap.
Yeah, and this is what I mean about like the pre-conscious. What Lawrence is highlighting here is part of how the fourth paralogism works, right? So we'll get into how those three terms function as we go through this section. But the big thing they're calling out right now, right, is that the function of Oedipus, first of all, Oedipus, it's not the whole of the paralogisms in that, right? It has a function in relation to them, right? And a very important one, because although Oedipus is an idea, right, it still circulates, right? It's not produced by the unconscious, but it affects the unconscious. It displaces desires. And that's very critical here, because that's going to be, and this is even what Freud's concerned with in Civilization, is discontents, right? In a sense, it is a question of like, why do people desire their own repression, right? Why desire father figures in the form of institutions? And this displacement is, I think, really critical in the creation of what they're calling a consequent desire, right?
All right, I will continue to move. I want to make sure, James Michael Schriff, Xanax. Oh, that's a wonderfully complicated name. You have Sniffy as your profile. Excellent. Do any of you have questions or comments or thoughts? It's worth asking. This is, again, central to this, and I can happy to go through the whole chapter, the section, and then we'll chat afterwards, and you can ask openly, because, maybe you want to see if something's coming, but I think we're doing an okay job so far describing it. I'm not terribly upset with our performance at this point. Oedipal desires are not at all repressed, nor do they have any reason to be. They are nevertheless in an intimate relationship with psychic repression, but in a different manner. Oedipal desires are the bait, the disfigured image by means of which repression catches desire in the trap. If desire is repressed, this is not because it is desire for the mother and for the death of the father. On the contrary, desire only becomes that, only because it is repressed. It takes on that mask, only under the reign of the repression that models the mask for it and plasters it on its face. Besides, it is doubtful that incest was a real obstacle to the establishment of society, as the partisans of an exchangeist conception claim. We have seen that there were other obstacles. The real danger is elsewhere. If desire is repressed, it is because every position of desire, no matter how small, is capable of calling into question the established order of a society. Not that desire is asocial, on the contrary, but it is explosive. There is no desiring machine capable of being assembled without demolishing entire social sectors. Despite what some revolutionaries think about this, desire is revolutionary in its essence. Desire, not left-wing holidays. And no society can tolerate a position of real desire without its structures of exploitation, servitude, and hierarchy being compromised. It's a lot they're saying here. That's a lot. Let's start with the beginning. Again, they open up the same discussion. Oedipal desires are the bait. They are not actually what is repressed. We are not actually repressing Oedipal desires. Desire gets grabbed. Desire gets repressed. It's not because of I want to actually fuck my mom and kill my dad. But
Brooks, you're cutting in and out really bad.
Oh shit! Really? Is that any better?
Say more words.
I am going to say a few more words now. Oh no, internet's going away.
The first bit was a little warbly, but it evened out.
My internet's dying.
Yeah, it sounds like it's an internet connection issue more than anything else.
Okay.
He sounds good to me now.
Now I'm back. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay, so this is why it sucks to do this on a home connection. It's the way it works. I'm back. Hello, everyone. Where did I cut off? Where did it get fucked up?
Basically, as soon as you started talking, after
Excellent.
you got done reading. Yeah.
Oh, good. I didn't say anything important, luckily. Fuck. I had an entire complete thought. I think I'll edit that into what I'm about to say, because I think I said it better the first time, but we'll see. To go in order, I was just going in order for the whole thing. The thing they're talking about here is that Oedipal desires are not the thing that is actually repressed when we are repressing them. And there is other things I'll discuss, but there's a lot. And psychic repression is repressed. Like there's a complex thing happening here, but it's that Oedipal desires are actually the bait, the image with which repression catches desire in its trap. That's the twist they're playing with. Representation grabs desire. And if desire is repressed, it's not because I want to fuck my mom and kill my dad. It's actually, it only is that because it's that mask only under the reign of repression that models the mask for it. That the repression shapes the mask. The law shapes the desire. It forces it into the shape that it needs to be in. And as they then go on, and this last bit I know is basically a summation of what's coming in all of chapter 3. We didn't have to somehow bypass. A lot of people have said this, that you need to bypass Oedipalization in order to have a society. Let's have a society. Let's do this thing. And it's like, no. There's a lot of other things, actually. There's a lot of other problems that are part of that whole thing. This is not it. This is not where it starts. This is not where it ends. There's a lot more going on there. And the desire itself, as a thing, is actually explosive. It would, if a desiring machine was ever actually formed, it would demolish entire social sectors. And we'll get into how all of this works. I kind of want to do a preview, but that's a quick summation for me of this chapter, this paragraph. Whew, it's a lot. I said it better the first time. Goddamn internet.
Yeah, and this links us back to what we were talking about in the first paragraph, right, with this question of suppression and repression. But I think ultimately, a kind of simple way of saying it is that that psychic repression isn't necessarily an inherent state of the psyche, right? And I don't think psychoanalysis necessarily believes that either. But it's an act of repressing, right? And the explanation here is a little bit different, because in this, it's not that Oedipus. How to say this? Well, to use a quote, right? The real danger is elsewhere. If desire is repressed, it is because every position of desire, no matter how small, is capable of calling into question the established order of society. Not that desire is asocial, on the contrary. So, right, why does Oedipus become something that's created, right? What's the conditions for its construction? And we get, like you're saying, we get this in chapter 3, but one of the aspects is the process, and Freud does touch on this a little bit, that there's a point about society where it seems to need to be Oedipalizing, and yet it doesn't want to be Oedipalizing, right? There's this kind of weird tension where it creates its repression, but it also doesn't want to be repressed, right? And you can kind of understand that here in the sense that the unconscious doesn't repress itself, right? And yet the unconscious encounters repression and is masked by it. I like that terminology a lot, right? It wears the mask of repression in the sense that it's affected to move certain ways, right? To act a certain way, and yet when this is that tension building up, right? And yet the unconscious doesn't produce itself in that manner.
One of the bits here that I really love about, like, the ending, whenever you
Brooks,
state,
can you say "I am Iron Man" for me?
oh no, is it all fucked up again?
Yes, but before you line real quick.
I am Iron Man.
Yes. Okay, now you gotta fix it.
Fuck. God, I hate everything right now. What is with me? In the ass.
It's because he's got the
is that
deep
any
voice
better?
like the song.
Is that any better?
It's better, but it's still warbly.
It's still warbly. Excellent. All right. This should be a little bit better.
Say more words for us.
Oh, I'm gonna keep saying words for you, Jack. Don't worry.
That's what I want. Yeah, it's fixed.
All right. God damn it. All right, one sec. I have to turn my ratio up a little bit higher. There we go. All right. Sorry, I think I lost like 3 programs while I was doing this just now, and when my internet decided to die. So, of course. Is it back? Is it all fucked up again?
Yeah. We can understand you, but it's really spotty.
What in the world? What in the world? Seriously.
That's good. I don't know what did it, but you actually sound good now.
Okay, whatever. I'm just going to start talking then until this fails and fucks up again. So, the last bit, as Michael was just translating for us, where they say, and I've never understood the line, I desire not left-wing holidays. The part that I think is amazing is that the original translation is desire not parties. Now, the phrasing of that fits so much better with it makes me very happy to hear. Just because desire not partying. So their reference here suddenly makes sense, and they've talked about it in a handful of other times, especially Guattari, that in revolutionary left-wing groups, and we see this very often, don't go to left Twitter, don't go to theory Twitter, it's all garbage. But one of the things that they all have in common, especially like the hardcore guys, is they're like, you got to have discipline. Like, it's like this idea is like, it's not just, this isn't just fun. Like it's like this really weird like mentality around things that I don't know how to put it. They have a really weird mentality around what desire is and the idea of how to sort of keep it in check and how to keep it in place. And at the same time, there's the free-flowing sort of hippie side of things that are always talking about, relax, party, blah, blah, blah. And Deleuze is kind of making sort of a secondary like commentary on that right now. That's how I read that, where it's like desire, not partying. Desire is revolution in its essence. Desire, not partying. And no society can tolerate a position of true desire without its structures of exploitation, without the repression in place. Like with the repression as it is in place, if we ever had a true desire, it would obliterate how society's operating. And I think that's fucking great. Like, that's a really great comment.
Yeah, that is why coding is so important with the socii, right? To your point, I think that's really the finger on it, right? It's a sort of Simone Weil point, but I think that's really it. Is that it's not the creation of a group, an institution, or anything like that, a collective. It's that you find the revolutionary, right? It's not essential to that being, but desire itself has that revolutionary potential, right? And that's going to be conditional for those groups. And what those groups do as desire produces them, being the key here, right? What those groups do as desire produces them. That has the revolutionary potential, but it also has the point about displacement, right? So groups don't, and this is kind of the irony, right? Groups can be produced through the revolutionary just as much as they can be affected in that production through displacement, right? It's not mutually exclusive by any means.
Love it. Any other comments, questions, anything before I move on to the next paragraph? All right, I'll continue. If a society is identical with its, I'm starting to crack up again.
Yeah, I wouldn't read it that way, but we can understand you though. But it's going to make interpretation difficult.
I can read.
Please read. I'm going to take a moment and do my audio. I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Do you mind leaving up your PDF? That's what I've been reading.
No, I'm not taking anything down. I'm not restarting my computer. I'm just going to work on my audio.
Cool. Okay. If a society is identical with its structures, an amusing hypothesis, then yes, desire threatens its very being. It is therefore of vital importance for a society to repress desire, and even to find something more efficient than repression. so that repression, hierarchy, exploitation, and servitude are themselves desired. It is quite troublesome to have to say such rudimentary things. Desire does not threaten a society because it is a desire to sleep with the mother, but because it is revolutionary. And that does not at all mean that desire is something other than sexuality. But that sexuality and love do not live in the bedroom of Oedipus. They dream instead of wide open spaces and cause strange flows to circulate that do not let themselves be stocked within an established order. Desire does not want, in quotes, revolution. It is revolutionary in its own right, as though involuntarily by wanting what it wants. From the beginning of this study, we have maintained both that social production and desiring production are one and the same, and that they have differing regimes, with the result that a social form of production exercises an essential repression of desiring production, and also that desiring production, a real desire, is potentially capable of demolishing the social form. But what is a real desire, since repression is also desired? How can we tell them apart? We demand the right to very deliberate analysis, for even in their contrary uses, let us make no mistake about it, the same syntheses are at issue.
This is where it's kind of interesting too, because you can start to see this point about when we get into the right being a question of how the id is regulated by the ego, right? And we've seen some of that play on the ego as part of the conscious, right? The thing that's kind of interesting here, if you want to juxtapose this with psychoanalysis, right, is they do have this overlap with psychoanalysis in the sense that the id is sort of a danger, or at least has the capacity for a danger in the sense of desire, right? And normally the ego kind of regulates it, but this I like. I like what they're going with here, because it's sort of the same point that with this point about desire, right? It's not that desire necessarily gets effaced, it's that it becomes a question of directing it, right? And to displace desire in this sense is to do that, right? It's to, like we said, kind of costume desire, but also to make things like hierarchy and that desirable and desired, right? To have them be part of the productive process, or at least affecting it.
So, hey, Brooks.
Hey, so is this any better at all? No?
I mean, it sounds good right now.
All right, good. It's actually Discord in my internet connection, so this is going to be a fun day for me to troubleshoot that. I wanted to jump in and say, just the part that I really also like here is the very direct line that they're drawing, where it's the idea of libidinal energy being purely sexual energy. I think is something that has been rather traditionally talked about, not far away, but they're not saying that it's not. They're also not saying it is. They're saying that desire sort of is its own thing and encompasses sort of the nature of all of these things in sort of their base level, which I really enjoy. I really like this paragraph for that.
Yeah, the move is going to be, as we know, right? And they've hinted at this throughout this section, but we see it in chapter 1, right? The desire, when we're talking about sexuality for them, we're not talking about anthropomorphic sexuality. So it's not human-based sexuality, right? Like Tim was saying, it's not genital-based sexuality. It's sexuality in terms of production and reproduction, right? Auto-production and that. Connectivity and disconnectivity and so on.
Love it. And then the last little bit I really like is that their direct thing here, desire does not want revolution. It's a really interesting sort of, I mean, we're talking about a deep nuance here, but as we get into especially the later sections about how revolution can exist, how it works, how desire plays into it, it is not that desire wants revolution. Desire does not want to be free. That's a misnomer. This is again, treating the idea that desire even has a chance of not being revolutionary, that desire does not have a chance of being free and connecting. Instead, it's by its own very nature, involuntarily wanting what it wants. It just is revolutionary as it goes. And I think that's going to be really important as just a core thing to start realizing they're making that switch.
Real quick, Mikhail asks, what do they mean by the social form? I think what they're saying there is that they're very careful in this paragraph not to create a universal idea of society any more than they want to say that there's a universal structures in society, right? So chapter 3, this is a huge part of the states, because when they go through like the primitive and the despotic, right, they don't think they're the same societies. They don't have that kind of universal thing. They criticize like Levi-Strauss in some capacity, or more so structuralism in a more general sense. And we'll see even like their differentiation from universal history there. But when they say social form, they're just talking about, I think, like different ways that society crops up, different organizations of it.
All right, I will move to the next paragraph, and I'm going to try to do my best to not go all wonky on this. It is clear what psychoanalysis expects to gain from claiming a link, where Oedipus would be the object of repression and even its subject through the intermediary of the superego. From this, it expects a cultural justification for psychic repression, a justification that makes psychic repression move into the foreground and no longer considers the problem of social repression as anything more than secondary from the point of view of the unconscious. That is why critics have been able to observe a conservative or reactionary turning point in Freud, from the moment that he gave an autonomous value to psychic repression as a condition of culture acting against the incestuous drives. Wright goes so far as to say that the crucial turning point of Freudianism, the abandonment of sexuality, comes when Freud accepts the idea of a primary anxiety that supposedly touches off psychic repression in an endogenous fashion. Consider the 1908 article on civilized sexual morality. Oedipus is not yet named here. Psychic repression is considered in terms of social repression, which gives rise to a displacement and acts on the partial drives, insofar as they represent in their own fashion a sort of desiring production, before being exercised again against the incestuous or other drives threatening legitimate marriage. But it then becomes evident that the more the problem of Oedipus and incest comes to occupy center stage, the more psychic repression and its correlates, suppression and sublimation, will be found on supposedly transcendent requirements of civilization, at the same time that the psychoanalyst plunges deeper into a familialist and ideological vision. Broken out simply, it's a crisp passage. It's psychoanalysis from this link attempts to go, excellent, you need repression of Oedipus. Hey, look, society too. There you go. Society is just like this. And the psychoanalyst can go deeper into the familialist and ideological vision, this deep representation, because Oedipus becomes the problem we must solve, or we must handle, or we must manage properly. Did any of that come through?
Well, I was going to comment. Yeah, as we're going through this, we're seeing how psychic and social repression aren't really mutually exclusive, are they?
We're actually seeing, I think, that they're almost the same thing. One
and the same in two different regimes, right?
Yes, that's the idea that he's pushing here is, hey, isn't it funny that psychoanalysis is trying to sort of backdoor this whole thing? With Deleuze, I probably should use different wording, given how he talks about such things. But if you're, oh, look, it's a human needs to be the society too. Like they're seeing that connection. That's interesting, and that kind of works in the sense that, yeah, we're part of society. Problems with one feel like they do get visited on many of us. Like there's a intuitionist sort of nature to that. But if we start from here, we need to really look at how these operate and how these work. And their argument's very clean that if that's the case, we need to really reframe how we deal with social psychic repression and suppression and sublimation as well. We do not need to relate again the reactionary compromises of Freudianism and even its theoretical surrender. This work has been accomplished several times in a profound way, rigorously and with nuances. We see no special problem in the possibility of a coexistence of revolutionary, reformist, and reactionary elements at the heart of the same theoretical and practical doctrine. We refuse to play take it or leave it, under the pretext that theory justifies practice, being born from it, or that one cannot challenge the process of cure except by stating from elements drawn from this very cure, as if every great doctrine were not a combined formation, constructed from bits and pieces, various intermingled codes and flux, partial elements and derivatives, that constitute its very life, or its becoming. As if we could reproach someone for having an ambiguous relationship with psychoanalysis, without first mentioning that psychoanalysis owes its existence to a relationship, theoretically and practically ambiguous, with what it discovers and the forces that it wields. I cannot help but immediately go back to logic of sense, and how things insist upon themselves. That's where my brain just went just now. But that's the comment here. There's a level where just naturally psychoanalysis is insisting upon its own sort of creation and success, and also don't critique us, no, stop there, but we're also very right, don't worry, no, stop there, over and over and over. And it's...
But the thing here is that there's a part of... You could almost say they're looking at the unconscious of psychoanalysis, right? So this point about the transcendent and that, we've talked about how this could be part of the preconscious, but even if we put that to the side, right, this could be something that psychoanalysis is actually not aware of, right? Which is that they're part of creating social and psychic repression, right? And this is really interesting because, we talked about this in the beginning of this chapter, right? That Freud begins with a conceptual lucidity for Deleuze and Guattari. That his creations in the early part of his work are really quite interesting, right? There's a lot of conceptual development, a lot of interesting work happening, right? And then as he goes, right, this interest in Oedipus and this point about the displacement of sexuality here, right? This seems to be very stark because what they're getting at is how psychoanalysis itself, if we take Freud as kind of at least a main creator of it, or at least his work is an important constructing of it, right? There's something that happened to psychoanalysis in this process, that it itself is not just an instrument of all this, right? But it itself is actually affected by it. So this point about the law of the father and then about, the incest prohibition, these are things that affect psychoanalysis, right? And it's not just that psychoanalysis creates them or anything like that. They become sort of conditions for what psychoanalysis is doing. And that's really important because schizoanalysis has to differentiate, but also work with that same problem, right? The same three syntheses being at stake in this point about displacement. This is why we don't have to play take it or leave with psychoanalysis, is because it's not inherently this way, but it is being produced in its own sense in this manner.
Yeah, no, Boskerd puts it well. Do not concern yourself with the socius behind the diagnosis. And I picture Wizard of Oz moment with Freud's head floating in the sky. Lacan behind the curtain. Any notes, any comments before I move on to the next paragraph? So we are nearing, I want to try to get through more of this pretty quick here. All right, and
just as a passing comment, the studies they're referring to on Freud and that's Marcuse and Reich. If anyone's interested, I checked the notes.
Excellent. We do not need to relate again the reactionary compromises of Freudianism and even its theoretical surrender. This work has been accomplished several times in a profound way, rigorously, and with nuances. We see no special problem in the possibility of a coexistence of revolutionary, reformist, and reactionary elements at the heart of the same theoretical and practical doctrine. We refuse to play take it or leave it under the pretext that theory... Did I just read this?
Yes. That what you just read, those are the two studies I was referring to.
Excellent. I had scrolled back up. Well, the critical study of Freudian ideology has been done, and done well. On the other hand, the history of the movement has never even been sketched out. The structure of the psychoanalytic group, its politics, tendencies, focal points, its self-application, suicides, its follies, the enormous group superego, everything that took place on the body of the master. What has come to be called the monumental work of Ernest Jones does not penetrate censorship, it codifies it. And the way the three elements coexisted, the exploratory, pioneering, revolutionary element, whereby desiring production was discovered, the classical cultural element, which reduces everything to a scene from Oedipal theatrical representation, a return to myth, and finally, the third element, the most disturbing, a sort of racket thirsting after respectability, which will never have done with getting itself recognized and institutionalized, a formidable enterprise of absorption of surplus value, with its codification of the interminable cure, its cynical justification of the role of money, and all the pledges it makes to the established order. All these elements were present in Freud, a fantastic Christopher Columbus, a brilliant bourgeois reader of Goethe, Shakespeare, and Sophocles, a masked Al Capone. It's a phenomenal Ken, please, I would love you to expand on it.
I mean, it's a great paragraph. And I think it speaks to things that are just recognizable and identifiable sort of anywhere in the scene of mental health counseling. Like I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with professionals who question the place of politics in some sort of mental health counseling practice, and that just seems absurd to me. And psychoanalysis has sort of been doing this for a long time too, until I guess some of the critical theory people coming out of there who are into psychoanalysis. But that part about the racket, like, it's such a big deal. Speaking of repressing representations, there's like, and you know, this is probably just my paranoid fantasy, but there's like this image of like surgical excellence and like some sort of male doctor wearing a white coat that is going to make you feel only pleasure, and its purpose in life is to eradicate any dissatisfactoriness. And like, this is like the representative in I don't know, fantasy of a lot of people that I have, not like most, but a lot of people that I've come into contact with in my educational journey. So I loved the paragraph.
What do you think of the three elements they look at there? You mentioned the racket part, but what do you think of like the other two?
I'm actually cooking at the same time.
Oh, okay. It was the conceptual revolutionary aspect, so like the creation of like discovery production, right? And then like the classical point about representation.
Yeah, I'm losing my connection, sort of. The revolutionary. Talking about this part, the exploratory, pioneering, revolutionary element whereby desiring production was discovered, the classical cultural element, which reduces everything to a scene from Oedipal theatrical representation, the return to myth, and finally the third element. Yeah. You know, I don't know where I fall on this myth thing either, to be honest. I think finding any sort of single myth that totally encapsulates existence or being or whatever is a misstep. And I guess that's what they're saying too here. But I mean, psychoanalysis did have a revolutionary element, right? They were coming into a time where, like, the materialism was like a metaphysics of substance. So materialism reigned, and Freud kind of came in and was a splash in that pond a little bit. But yeah, he was trying to get included into academia and make psychoanalysis a science, and that sort of made him a part of the racket, you know. Then like came like reified structures of subjectivity that you're born with that can't change, and you know, everyone is either one of the three. Everyone's either neurotic, perverse, or psychotic. And speaking of things that retroactively affect psychoanalysis itself, these subjectivities do that, because then you have all these people sort of like in this paranoiac state of self-policing, trying not to look neurotic, psychotic, or perverse around each other, and so then there is the return to myth again too, that and is the double bind paralogism as well. I hope I approached your question.
I just add really quick. Oh, Ken, I'm echoing through you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The last, I like their summary really quick also of the three types through Freud himself. On the one hand, the fantastic Christopher Columbus, not sure we'd use the reference today, but the idea of the explorer, right? Like that idea, the pioneering revolutionary element. Not sure Christopher Columbus fits that, but hey. But then you also have the bourgeois reader of like classic tales and stories and all of that, as well as a masked Al Capone, which is, I mean, they're very against the entire conception of bringing capital into this and having people basically pay for their own care as a concept. But to use Al Capone as the setup, I really do like that as well. I dig it.
That's unique, right? Because capital is a condition for psychoanalysis, right? And at the same time, they don't want to be defined in terms of, and I don't blame them for this, right? They don't want to be defined in terms of having to take money, because for most scientists, this is a problem, right? Like, I have friends in engineering, and you know, once you're in, there's a huge difference between building a car with your friend, right, from the ground up, if you like, and doing that for a company, right? The legalities, the way that money affects that. Yeah, and that's something I think you're right, that psychoanalysis has its own self-awareness to it, but its own, and again, you know, we're sort of in the unconscious of psychoanalysis in this book. You know, it has its own sort of paranoiac engagement with, right? And I mean that in the either or sense here.
I would agree, and I think their big take with it also is the second half of that, where it's not just the absorption of surplus value, which is something they're definitely going on, but the codification of the interminable cure, which is a hell of a way to do it and set it up. It's a setup. The eternal, interminable cure. Capital. All right, I'm going to continue to the next paragraph. The strength of Reich consists in having shown how psychic repression depended on social repression, which in no way implies a confusion of the two concepts, since social repression needs psychic repression precisely in order to form docile subjects and to ensure the reproduction of the social formation, including its repressive structures. But social repression should not be understood by using as a starting point a familial repression coextensive with civilization. Far from it. It is civilization that must be understood in terms of a social repression inherent to a given form of social production. Social repression bears on desire, and not solely on needs or interests, only by means of sexual repression. The family is indeed the delegated agent of this psychic repression, insofar as it ensures a mass psychological reproduction of the economic system of a society. Of course, it should not be concluded from this that desire is Oedipal. On the contrary, it is the social repression of desire, or sexual repression, that is the stasis of libidinal energy, that actualizes Oedipus and engages desire in this requisite impasse, organized by the repressive society. Fuck the nuclear family. Like, that's what this is. This is him coming straight at the nuclear family as a conception and saying, hey, this isn't about like starting from like there. We need to talk about how we organize individuals within the society, how we create repression, how we put people together. And a family is a delegated agent of this psychic repression. And yes, don't fuck the nuclear family, really, obviously. But fair. Okay, bad wording. You got me, Boastkerd. You win. The point, I think, is still, I think, valid. The challenge within, especially capital, is we all, and I think everyone here generally has the same core experience. You are Oedipalized because you live in a nuclear family. All of your connections, and they've talked about this, and they will continue to. All of the connections you have are made through mommy, daddy. My son is 3.5. I mean, it's COVID. There's not a lot of social stuff happening. So everything he's experiencing in life, he experiences through himself, through mother, or through father. It's just the nature of it. And that in and of itself is damaging in this way. It actualizes Oedipus and engages desire in this requisite impasse, organized by the repressive society, because this is how we do this. It's a hell of a way to sort of flip that around from the idea of, start with familial repression, coextensive from civilization. It's like, no. We need to talk about civilization in terms of familial repression, which is a really great way to sort of talk about that. We're on 2.7, Joe, halfway through.
Can I bounce an off you and see what you think?
No.
No. Okay, then I'll just shut up.
I was joking. Please do. I was
completely being an ass. Okay. I can never tell where we are on time. So whenever we were first going through this, I got the sense that like what was being said was that the nuclear family is the issue, causes the issue of familial repression. And just sort of thinking about this, it seems like the issue with the nuclear family is that's like the social safety net. And you only have 2 points of failure before you're sort of screwed. And maybe it's not so much nuclear family that's the problem, but that capitalism sort of depends on the nuclear family being a social safety net. That seems to be the issue. Because of course, like Oedipus may exist, or Oedipus does exist in some places, but I don't think it's transcendent. I don't think it's an existential circumstance for every single person by law, handed down by nature, whatever. And so you're going to have like the weird Oedipal stuff sometimes, but I really think it's that social safety net issue that seems to be the problem with the nuclear family.
I'm going to take a crack. I don't think you're wrong. I think this is an incredibly complex thing, how our desires get organized, how we build relationships with things as we grow. And I would say that it probably starts in one place and ends in the other. A child, for example, has no concept of what social safety net is and doesn't really, my son has no idea that he's wholly dependent on mom and dad. Like, he doesn't know that as a thing. Like, he gets it, and he has demands of mom and dad, and he'd be sad, but he doesn't like think, if mom and dad died tomorrow, I'd be on the street. He's not there yet. But all of his sort of thoughts and everything he has does come through the idea of daddy teaching him a thing or mommy teaching him a thing or doing a thing with him or being around him. So everything he does relates to mommy, daddy, me, because that's the nature of, we have a nuclear family. It's the nature of it. Welcome to things. But I think as we get older and that is sort of built into us at that point, I would agree. I think that's a really good insight that at some point the switch happens where no longer is it that my representations and my understandings of things are being built through mommy, daddy, me. Mommy is who she is, and that's my understanding. And daddy's doing what he's doing. My son's learned daddy cooks all the time. Mommy doesn't cook. Men cook, women don't. Like if you want to look at it in a shitty way, that's like an example of how that sort of happens to kids. That sucks. And that happens with sexuality. It happens with everything. At some point, when the rest of the world starts, making itself visible, and parents place themselves as the arbiters or the gatekeepers or the safety net, which happens to me, happens to a lot of people. It's not abnormal, especially in our society. I think you have a good point that suddenly now I'm dependent on the representations that I've grown up with, and it changes my relationships to them even a step further. Is that what you're getting at, Ken?
Yeah, sort of, but I'm also getting at just the mere fact of magicians, because, kids may not have the language for it, but they can identify and put things together pretty fast. And kids can recognize whenever, you're having a hard time putting food on the table, or whenever you're about to lose your shelter or something. This stuff registers with kids as young as like 4 years old.
This is true. It's true.
No, this is true. It's true.
And that's sort of what I'm talking about to a certain extent.
I think that's. I think, yeah. I mean, the whole point here. The whole point is all of this. It's the way that repression happens socially is by placing us into these familial circumstances where all of our representation is built through mommy, daddy, me. All of our dependencies exist in terms of mommy, daddy, me. All of my desires happen through mommy, daddy, me. All of my wants and wishes and hopes for the future are mommy, daddy, me. Everything becomes that. Like, there's no third or fourth thing that's in that sort of grouping. Everything has to be biunivocalized. It becomes mommy, daddy, daddy, mommy, like everything. And when you're talking about what you're saying, it's putting it's another layer that I don't actually know if they explore that in here, but that seems like that would be really useful to go into.
Well, they're not going to get too much into like child psychology and like Piaget, but where you guys, I think, where we can expand your discussion is that representation isn't necessarily production, right? So the representation of a father, the codification of a father, right? When we're talking about an assemblage, so like say Brooks and his son, it's not necessarily the case. In fact, I don't think it is the case that the representation of father and son produces Brooks. The production in the unconscious that's so I was saying that representation isn't necessarily production. In fact, I think quite often it's not. So when we're working with an assemblage of, say, like a parent and their child, there's a codification and a functionality we can talk about there. And there's a paralogistic sense of it, right, in the sense that it's supposed to be, right, that it's created in a certain sense, right? Created through the paralogisms. But that's not necessarily how it takes place, right? The representation isn't necessarily what produces acts within what we call family. The codification might affect how those are produced, but it can also be changed in the process. Whereas the paralogisms, I think, are working with directing all of that, right? But if we go into the production of the unconscious, and they talk about it as an orphan, right? It's not being produced in that sense, right? The representation of a father isn't what produces the unconscious anymore. The unconscious necessarily produces that. So even to your point about the nuclear family, when we're talking about institutions as fathers, right? I think that to me speaks a little bit more to like the psychic repression. But in terms of the social repression, right, that becomes a condition for that. And this is what they're criticizing in terms of the racketeering in that, right? What's going on socially gets displaced onto the familial in this manner, right? But it doesn't have to always be the familial, right? Bosses do a certain thing, or more so, hierarchy has a certain function here, particularly like a stasis of it all.
Reich was the first to raise the problem of the relationship between desire and the social field. He went further than Marcuse, who treats the problem lightly. He is the true founder of a materialist psychiatry. Situating the problem in terms of desire, he is the first to reject the explanations of a summary Marxism too quick to say the masses were fooled, mystified. But since he had not sufficiently formulated the concept of desiring production, he did not succeed in determining the insertion of desire into the economic infrastructure itself, the insertion of the drives into social production. Consequently, revolutionary investment seemed to him such that the desire moving within it simply coincided with an economic rationality. As to the reactionary mass investments, they seemed to him to derive from ideology, so that psychoanalysis merely had the role of explaining the subjective, the negative, the inhibited, without participating directly as psychoanalysis in the positivity of the revolutionary movement or in the desiring creativity. To a certain extent, didn't this amount to a reintroduction of the error or the illusion? The fact remains that Reich, in the name of desire, caused a song of life to pass into psychoanalysis. He denounced, in the final resignation of Freudianism, a fear of life, a resurgence of the ascetic ideal, a cultural broth of bad consciousness. Better to depart in search of the orgone, he said to himself, in search of the vital and cosmic element of desire, than to continue being a psychoanalyst under those conditions. No one forgave him this, whereas Freud got full pardon. Reich was the first to attempt to make the analytic machine and the revolutionary machine function together. In the end, he only had his own desiring machines, his paranoiac, miraculous, and celibate boxes, with metallic inner walls lined with cotton and wool. I love that. It's just great. It's worth really going through some writing. Our friends at the Acid Horizon podcast, I have to recommend. They just did, I think, was it last week or the week before, they just did a piece on Reich that's excellent and really sort of goes through a great deal of his thought. And if you're wondering at all about Reich, I'm not going to spend time explaining it because that does a far better and succinct version of it. So, any questions, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I really like about what they're saying right here is they give him a lot of credit because he's able to see that, right? Like, it's not a point about the masses being tricked, right? This is, they want this stuff, right? They want this kind of repression, right? They're not inherently repressed, but it's a process of production. But I like this point a lot that they're making because it's not a derivation from ideology, right? So, like, when we're talking about the materialist psychiatry, and if we take that in like the Marxian sense, it often is a point about ideological criticisms. In Deleuze and Guattari don't say that those are unvaluable, right? But I do like this point that ideology doesn't necessarily explain the process of production. And I think that's really important as we're going through this, right? That Oedipus itself, an ideological critique of it, is insufficient for a discussion of its production.
Yeah, to have something become actually materialist, we have to talk about how things work and what they make. And ideology simply is unsatisfying to that end, for sure.
I mean, even that last sentence you like, right? Like, it's not ideology. In the end, he only had his own desire machines, his paranoiac, miraculous, and celibate boxes with metallic inner walls lined with cotton and wool, right? No ideology there, importantly.
No, none, but also nothing connecting and pumping between them. The celibate boxes with inner walls lined with cotton and wool, which is a interesting setup. I think I'll continue to the next paragraph. Pardon me. Psychic repression distinguishes itself from social repression by the unconscious nature of the operation and by its result. Quote, even in the inhibition of revolt has become unconscious. A distinction that expresses clearly the difference in nature between the two repressions. But a real independence cannot be concluded from this. Psychic repression is such that social repression becomes desired. It induces a consequent desire, a faked image of its object, on which it bestows the appearance of independence. Strictly speaking, psychic repression is a means in the service of social repression. What it bears on is also the object of social repression, desiring production. But it in fact implies an original double operation. The repressive social formation delegates its power to an agent of psychic repression, and correlatively, the repressed desire is as though masked by the faked, displaced image to which the repression gave rise. Psychic repression is delegated by the social formation, while the desiring formation is disfigured and displaced by psychic repression. You may have heard Jack and I having a little bit of back and forth a little earlier when we were saying, oh, maybe they're connected. And it's, oh, here we go. This is the nature of it. It's psychic repression ends up because of the displacement, because of this paralogism. You actually desire social repression. You actually desire social repression as a consequent desire, and it's an amazing process that the entire thing takes place. And again, this is how that paralogism functions at a base level.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that you can, of course, be conscious about your displacement. So that's actually a very practical insight to have, that you are displacing it. Sometimes, like you get like fairly emotional, I suppose. Sometimes I what I do to take myself, I self-analyze a lot, because I think it enhances my analytical skills. I can't remember who suggested this. I think it was Freud himself, but that's not really a matter of importance. So the thing is that you like, okay, so this happened. Like a girl that I haven't talked to in a while. Um, I hit her up, started the conversation, and after 2 messages, she out of the blue blocked me, which was, of course, um, I felt a lot of things because of that. But so I started basically to go through these things, and then like everything that popped in my head, I basically, they are like, how do you say, they are more or less um, like linked, or you make them link. You make these connections between like different states of emotions. Like I remember, for example, as a child that, or maybe not a child, but some sort of adult, like um, I would get refused to participate in like. Wasn't picked for the football team. I was picked like, I don't know, not last, but almost last, and that bummed me out a lot. So that was something that popped up in my head, and these things so get linked to the initial act, and if you like that are conscious of that, you can say, okay, so now I am working not with, well, because you get misguided often. Like you think you're working with, okay, so this girl blocked me, so I'm working this out, but actually it kind of triggers other scenarios which you play out, which are very familiar with, because you want to put yourself at ease. That's the unconscious part. That is the um, like the unconscious desire, why you desire repression. What it makes you do is it's basically a vice that puts you at ease as much as possible. It wants to make you relax. It's there to take care of you in a sense. So what happens is that for you spontaneously, these thoughts pop in your head that are very familiar, which correspond to the things you think you should feel. And if you realize that and you start to take these uh, consider these thoughts and move away, or like don't like block out the thought of, okay, again the example, she blocked me. I didn't like to forget about it and focus on other stuff at all. I was just, okay, so she blocked me, let's see what pops up. And for example, okay, picked last was one thing, and they started to think about it. Yeah, I'm kind of like feeling the same emotions as that time, so let's see what popped up next. And next was like uh, maybe an argument I had with my sister, in which she made me feel like I wasn't that well adjusted, enough to be with um, yeah. To be in a relationship is a little bit of a big word, to be relating to people, on some sort of level, which was a fairly mean thing to say to me at the time. So I started to basically make more or less a list in my head of things that popped up, and then I actually the transgression that happened, um, like the repression, which was unconscious, did it like get ever like uh, like still, or it
I'm
did
gonna
it
I'm
like.
gonna pull back. So
Mhm.
to relate it to this paragraph. Sorry, I lost the thread, Joe. I'm sorry. I lost the thread of what you're trying to say.
Okay, I can be a bit more concrete, because I this is more like me ruminating to myself, so I can make eventually a concrete point. The point I'm making is that social repression is of course unconscious, but the conscious aspect is the result of the desiring of repression. So you well it's if you can modify the desire by accepting what it gives you. If you are conscious that there is something that works repressing you, you can start to decide if the things it feeds you are indeed repressing or not. It does not mean that everything that social repression in the unconscious makes you go through, that it is inherent to repression. There is still I mean, of course the process is repressing. You are unaware of that, so you can't help that. But the result, what it feeds you, doesn't have to be repressing. It can still function on a different
Right, right,
level.
right.
So is that a bit more a concise
Yes, no,
with
that was better, and I think yes. So, um, and I think actually that bears into just to make sure I'm at the bottom of 119. The family is delegated against is the delegated agent, or am I past that? Because I was trying to find a quote and I lost my place. Anyone?
That is correct. The
All
family
right.
is the delegated agent.
All right. I'm going to read from there because I think the next two paragraphs, Joe, I think get into that a little bit. So I want to kind of dive ahead. Um,
I just wanted to apologize, because the example was too bad, because it was too fresh, and therefore a bad example.
no,
And I started rambling
you're
about
good.
my
You're good.
personal life, which is kind of ridiculous. So, but I hope it can be overlooked.
No, you're fine. Again, it's uh, do try fewer sentences because I lost the thread. You actually had a great point when we got you to say it. So it's just the fewer sentences I think would help. But I want to make sure we dive forward a little bit. The family is the delegated agent of psychic repression, or rather, the agent delegated to psychic repression. The incestuous tribes are the disfigured image of the repressed. The Oedipus complex, the process of Oedipalization, is therefore the result of this double operation. It is one and the same movement that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial drives. In this way, the family drives relationship is substituted for the relationship between the two orders of production, in a diversion where the whole of psychoanalysis goes astray. And the interest of such an operation, from the point of view of social repression, from the point of view of social production, becomes evident, for the latter could not otherwise ward off desire's potential for revolt and revolution. By placing the distorting mirror of incest before desire, that's what you wanted, isn't it? Desire is shamed, stupefied. It is placed in a situation without exit. It is easily persuaded to deny itself in the name of the more important interests of civilization. Well, what if everyone did the same? What if everyone married his mother and kept his sister for himself? There'd no longer be any differentiation. Any exchange is possible. We must act quickly and soon. Incest, slandered, shallow stream. Again, put very nicely here, I think, a good amount of what actually Joe was saying, that by placing the distorted mirror of incest before desire, desire becomes itself shamed, stupefied, placed in a situation without exit. It is easily persuaded at this point to deny itself in the name of the better interests of civilization. That operation is incredibly important for everyone here to be able to grasp, and I want to make sure you're able to. This is one of those. It's another one of those sentences. It's like they're going to be going over this quite a bit, but this is something I think we would say we're seeing very cleanly in our own society, my own society, America. Desire being shamed, stupefied, placed in a situation without exit, becomes persuaded to deny itself in the name of interests of civilization.
So we can start to apply some of our terminology here, right? Because I said we would try and come back to it. So the displaced represented, that which gives a falsified apparent image, as my trapped desire. Sorry, that's what incest is doing here, right? The latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as ancestral familial drives, right? So, we can start to walk in some of this terminology as we're going through here.
Yep. And yes, this plays into the double bind, Bostgerd. It's a little different than that. This is not the double bind is the impasse of damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of placement of a thing, emotional blackmail, social blackmail in some kind of way. That plays into this, but we're talking actually about the actual nature of desire and its own production by the distorting mirror of incest being placed before desire. So imagine desire's kind of walking along, connecting, disconnecting. It looks up, there's this distorted mirror of incest, and it goes, oh, I want that? Well, that's fucked up. I'm fucked up. Well, I shouldn't do that because it would ruin society. And then,
I would say, oh, yeah, sorry, I go, so, finish.
No, go.
Yeah, like the double bind is actually like more or less the ideal, the ideality of the situation where you like have the same process of the desiring consciously, because then if that would happen, then of course it would negate each other. If like the unconscious and the conscious would intersect in um, in uh, 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 su- um, in the phantasm or in the fantasy of a double bind, that would be ideal, because it would resolve all the problems, because it would actually cancel each other out. So you would be completely, I would say, maybe enlightened in a sense. Um, And so it's important to identify with your unconscious, but still separate it enough, that you can that that you can't replicate it. It's not replicatable, but
Well,
it is something that
it gets trapped, and it's this last thing Jack says in the text in the chat, that the stupefaction of law stymies desiring production, while also displacing it. Desiring still goes. Like, it's not like desire goes, oh, I guess I'll stop here. Like, it's got stuff it wants to go with, and it sees this distorted mirror and it goes, oh, cool, I'll want that. Well, I guess I'll avoid that. And it's like the double bind plays into it, but this is not the double bind. This is specifically the paralogism of displacement. Like, I just want to be very clear about that. This is specifically that. The double bind plays into this. Like, all of these things are like, all these things play in. There's no such thing where I'm like, well, today I'm being affected by the double bind. Tomorrow I'll try a little bit of the third paralogism. Like, this shit's always happening in a lot of different ways to us, and it's a very complex, sort of multi-layered reality.
But let's say let's like to make to put my point in analogy. Like, it's like your unconscious desired repression comes up with the idea, okay, I want to fuck my sister, for example, and then if you like consciously want to fuck your mom, like, the situation gets totally resolved, because you are then totally comfortable with the idea of incest on both layers, and then you can escape, the mirror. You're
I'm not
longer looking in the mirror, I think, and
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm not sure I go that far. I think so. For me, the escape here is about understanding that the prohibition in the first place is absurd, and that frees your desires to have other connections and do other things. The nature of the incest prohibition, for example, as a base layer of society that needs to affect us, is insane. It doesn't have to be its own thing. There's other reasons that we have such things, and we don't need to necessarily have prohibitions.
I'll try a little of the dialectic. So again, the same example. So your unconscious the desired repression feeds you. You want to fuck your mother, and sorry, all the way around. I said all the way. It doesn't matter. You feeds you. I want to fuck your mother, and you actually want to feed your sister. Like, I want to fuck your sister. Then the fucking of your mother, the part, gets, because it's similar, gets overcoded. It gets overcoded with something else. So the only thing that keeps existing is the base difference between sister and mother. That's the only thing that keeps existing, because you're unconscious, because it's repressive, automatically blocks out the similarities in your conscious.
No. There's no such thing as mother or sister in your unconscious.
No, that's what I'm saying. So in consciousness, you differentiate between mother and sister. The only part that gets overcoded is the incest prohibition, which is of course a big problem in the unconscious. So if those are similar, if you like have the desire to again have incestuous intercourse with your mother, and if you are unconsciously, and if you have conscious desire of having incestuous
this is going to be a larger discussion. I want to try to. We've got like 20 minutes left. I want to try to get through 2 more pages because I really don't want to have to redo like an entire talk on just 1 page of this. Let's schedule some time to go through this and have this discussion because I think it's worthwhile. But for now, I just want to like tear through the text. So we're going to keep pushing through. Any questions or comments on this paragraph, specifically interpreting issues you're having, other things like that?
Well, I'm just fascinated by the concept of the double bind in regards to this.
I know, but it's a discussion to have, but it's not part of this. Like it's literally like the answer for real quick for Boskert is no, this isn't the double bind, is the answer. It's part of this whole thing and there's a larger discussion, but it's not what he's discussing here.
Yeah, I disagree insofar as like when you put it into consciousness in either case, right? We're moving toward intentionality.
No. I'm asking. I'm not that. We'll discuss that another time. I'm stopping this. But this is a long discussion. I'm asking specifically: is the double bind being discussed here?
Oh, okay. In that respect, it has a place, but like you said, it has a place in service of the fourth paralogism, right? So it is happening in terms of like when they say desire, as I said, like when desire is stymied in that, there is a point in which there's for the displacement, right? When we're talking about the double bind, we're talking about, in a sense, it's a certain stymie, but there's a functional stymie, right? So in the way that the desire machines would operate, there is, right, the functionalism that the body organs would have. But then when we're talking about the stymie that the paralogism and the displacement produce, right? With this point about the paralysis, that's the impasse where desiring production is producing, and yet it finds itself faced with an image of that sort of stupefies it. And so, in doing that, right, the larger point for the double bind here would be that there's a point about the functionalisms in that mirror, right? So the unconscious, in that sense, they're sort of suggesting the unconscious is almost seeing a reflection of itself producing incest, right? And that's the functionalism of the double bind there that kind of creates this stymie, but is not produced by the unconscious, right? This is where that tension really builds. That's all I have, Brooks.
Cool. I will continue the next paragraph so we can keep charging through. Although we can see social production's interest in such an operation, it is less clear what makes this operation possible from the point of view of desiring production itself. We do have, however, the elements of a response. Social production would need at its disposal, on the recording surface of the socius, an agent that is also capable of acting on, of inscribing the recording surface of desire. Such an agent exists, the family. It belongs essentially to the recording of social production, as a system of reproduction of the producers, and, doubtless, at the other pole, the recording of desiring production on the body without organs is brought about through a genealogical network that is not familial. Parents only intervene here as partial objects, flows, signs, and agents of a process that outflanks them on all sides. At most, the child innocently relates to his parents some part of the astonishing productive experience he is undergoing with his desire. But this experience is not related to them as such. Yet this is precisely where the operation arises. Under the precocious action of social repression, the family slips into and interferes with the network of desiring genealogy. It assumes the task of alienating the entire genealogy. It confiscates the numen. But see here, God is daddy. The desiring experience is treated as if it were intrinsically related to the parents, and as if the family were its supreme law. Partial objects are subjected to the notorious law of totality unity, acting as lacking. The disjunctions are subjected to the alternative of the undifferentiated, or exclusion. Yes, Boskert, because I said so, becomes a brutal cudgel. The thing to go back to again, they're very clear here that the family is impressing upon children. It's as I described earlier, me and my wife, to our son, we intervene in essentially his entire life. We will for a while, but we don't do it as mommy daddy. We as mommy daddy are partial objects. We're elements that are part of everything that happens sort of around us and outflanks us on all sides, as they say. At most, the parent is related in some part of the astonishing productive experience the child's undergoing with the desire, but it's not related to them as such. It's not that everything becomes daddy or becomes mommy. It's sort of the relationship of that things are related to or through or with mommy daddy. And then that social repression comes in, and the family becomes the rules. The name of the father, for example, as Lacan may call it, or the weak mom, I think, is another standard in this bearing straight. We have these representations then formed for us and sort of presented for us, despite not really having that be the nature of how desiring production creates relationships or builds a child's body without organs. It's a really fascinating breakdown of it. Are there any questions on this? Any issues with the phrasing that they have, wording? Because it's a complex thing. I think generally we've been on track for this, but it's worth asking.
I like that you're bringing the body without organs in here and that, right? Because they, like when they say God is, it confiscates the Newman, but see here, God is daddy, right? We are talking about the synthesis of recording and the synthesis of distribution more largely, right? And I think that's really important here when they talk about the genealogy and that, because we are talking about what gets recorded in the body without organs, but also the distribution of libidinal energy.
Yeah, well, and it's the last little bit here is really interesting phrasing. That partial objects are subjected to the notorious law of totality unity, acting as lacking. Everything my son experiences through me or with me with me as a partial object. There's like an edge of daddy involved in all of it. Like there just is, and he pretends that he's daddy, and there's some things he relates directly to me. But if we sit here and we say, excellent, daddy is a thing. He is the concept. He is the idea, and he is God. Suddenly, the totality, the partial object I am that he's relating to, becomes a totality that is by nature repressive. It acts as lacking. I'm no longer just like Brooks the dad who, like, I'm just a dad to him. Like I'm dadding. I'm not like dad. But if I were to tell him, like, I'm dad, you do what I say, that's a different mentality. Now this idea of dad has to be a whole thing. It's no longer just this sort of edge thing, this partial object. And this completely fucks everything up. This fucks the whole recording process up. As the final line says, the disjunctions are subjected to the alternative of the undifferentiated or exclusion. This is, again, another paralogism comes into play here.
Yeah, and you've got to keep in mind how something like that in a paralogism is created, right? We're talking about how one of the partial objects, right, becomes detached, right, and transcendent. And this affects the signifying chain, right? So, and they're going to go right back to it in a few paragraphs. So I won't go too deep into it here. But the creation of lack is a point about how something gets detached and made whole. And that affects the distribution, right? Because at that point, we are reaching the double bind, right? We're reaching an exclusive use of functionality here, which I like their point here, is alienating from the what's on the body, the organs, right? It's alienating from the different distributions, the different uses that have been made of these partial objects. So I like their point that it affects that quite directly.
Agreed. I will continue. The family is therefore introduced into the production of desire and will perform a displacement, an unparalleled repression of desire, commencing with the earliest age of the child. Social production delegates the family to psychic repression, and if the family is able, in this manner, to slip into the recording of desire, it is because the body without organs on which this recording is accomplished already exercises, on its own account, as we have seen, a primal repression of desiring production. It falls to the family to profit from this, and to superimpose the repression that is properly termed secondary, this being a function delegated to the family or one to which the family is delegated. Psychoanalysis has clearly demonstrated the difference between these two repressions, but has not shown the scope of this difference or the distinction between their respective regimes. That is why psychic repression, in the strict sense, does not content itself with repressing real desiring production, but offers a displaced apparent image of the repressed, by substituting a familial recording for the recording of desire. Desiring production taken as a whole does not assume the well-known Oedipal figure, except in the familial translation of its recording. Translation, betrayal. I actually think I want to just go to the next paragraph. We're 2 away from the end, and I just think I'm going to continue. At times we say that Oedipus is nothing, almost nothing, within the order of desiring production, even in the child. At other times we say that it is everywhere, in the enterprise of domesticating the unconscious, of representing desire and the unconscious. To be sure, we have never dreamed of saying that psychoanalysis invented Oedipus. Everything points in the opposite direction. The subjects of psychoanalysis arrive already Oedipalized. They demand it. They want more. Newsflash, Stravinsky declares before dying, "My misfortune, I am sure of it, came from my father's being so distant with me, and from the small amount of affection shown to me by my mother. So I decided that one day I would show them." If even artists give in to this, it would be a mistake to stand on ceremony and hold to the ordinary scruples of a diligent psychoanalyst. If a musician tells us that music does not attest to active and conquering forces, but to reactive forces, to reactions to daddy-mommy, we have only to play again on a paradox dear to Nietzsche, while barely modifying it. Freud as musician. I will continue. No, psychoanalysts invent nothing, though they have invented much in another way and have legislated a lot, reinforced a lot, injected a lot. All that psychoanalysts do is to reinforce the movement. They add a last burst of energy to the displacement of the entire unconscious. What they do is merely to make the unconscious speak according to the transcendent uses of synthesis imposed on it by other forces. Global persons, the complete object, the great phallus, the terrible undifferentiated of the imaginary, symbolic differentiations, segregation. What psychoanalysts invent is only the transference, a transference Oedipus, a consulting room Oedipus of Oedipus, especially noxious and virulent, but where the subject finally has what he wants, and sucks away at his Oedipus on the full body of the analyst. And that's already too much. But Oedipus takes shape in the family, not in the analyst's office, which merely acts as the last territoriality. And Oedipus is not made by the family. The Oedipal uses of synthesis, Oedipalization, triangulation, castration, all refer to forces a bit more powerful, a bit more subterranean than psychoanalysis, than the family, than ideology, even joined together. There we have all the forces of social production, reproduction, and repression. This can be explained by the simple truth that very powerful forces are required to defeat the forces of desire, lead them to resignation, and substitute everywhere reactions of the daddy-mommy type for what is essentially active, aggressive, artistic, productive, and triumphant in the unconscious itself. It is in this sense, as we have seen, that Oedipus is an application, and the family a delegated agent. Even by application it is hard. It is difficult for a child to live and experience himself as an angle. And I'm not going to actually try to even attempt to do this.
The footnote is at the bottom if you want the English.
Yeah, I'm just gonna read straight from Artaud's English translation. This child, he is not there. He is but an angle to come, and there is no angle. And yet it is precisely this world of father-mother which must go away. It is this world, split in two, doubled, in a state of constant disunion, also willing a constant unification, around which turns the entire system of this world, maliciously sustained by the most somber organization. If you would like to read it, Michael, you're more than welcome to. It's a wonderful piece to end it with, though, Artaud. How all of it works, all of it. Representation, our own repression, how it comes from, how it works, is not Oedipus. It is not psychoanalysts that put it upon us. These things were here. Psychoanalysts are playing around on the surface of such things and are digging around trying to find it. The nature of repression begins with how we structure a child as they grow and a person as they desire and as they learn how representation works. It's an amazing section. I adore that ending so very much. Any thoughts, any questions, any comments?
Yeah, definitely. Like the part where he says, or they say, of course, that everything which the unconscious does is making speak according to transcendent um, um, customs and so on. That is actually the exact same point which Sartre makes in Being and Nothingness, but he concludes that therefore the unconscious does not exist, and here they attribute it to um, more. Yeah, it's actually kind of unclear or obscured. I think they're not very clear what this means. No, the to the unconscious. Does it? I mean, is it just that psychoanalytic because and like on the one hand you say like okay analytics psychoanalysts kind of misuse the unconscious, they use it the wrong way, but and this has great effects, this is a great problem, but on the other hand um, they say, but yeah, still the unconscious exists like a clean slate, So how can how are those like things? How can they exist? Together. How can they be put together? I found that a little bit of kind of a weak point. Point to make because you can't have one and the one your what's the saying, like your bread and eat it at two or something. um
You can't have your cake and eat it.
yeah, exactly. And I think they're getting that cake and eating it at two at this point.
I
They're
think
saying like
I like that. I like
yeah.
that. I think that's fair.
See, I actually disagree though, because I think that argument only works if you're gonna follow Sartre and go for something like right, the move that consciousness becomes a way of dealing with this whole thing, right, an intentionality. And like you could go that way, but for Deleuze Guattari, I think that will be insufficient because at best, one, they don't agree that the unconscious doesn't exist, but more so, like when they're setting up this process and everything, right? And particularly the psychoanalysts and the transference, they're talking about how psychoanalysis here transfers desire in a sense, right? So this is a wonderful play on displacement because it's really clever use of the transference here, in that what the unconscious produces,
Transference,
right,
not transference.
mhm, gets transferred, right? So it gets
Mhm.
displaced onto something else. Here we're talking about incest. Now, in terms of the unconscious and that thought, its production, like at best, I think you can only argue that with consciousness you can work with the pre-conscious, right? It's not going to get you, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not going to get you into the actual production of the unconscious and uh, everything it produces in terms of subjectivity, disjunctions, and connections, right?
Sorry, was that a question or a hypothetical?
It's a mannerism of mine. No, it's
It's
not going to
fine.
take you that far back, to put it in a statement.
Hmm. Well, look, in the beginning, they basically said that the socius, the desire of the socius, is analogous to phenomenology. And Sartre was, of course, in Being a Nothingness, a phenomenologist, and in his philosophical work. I am never, if I am talking about Sartre, I'm never referring to his existential works. So, in his the philosophy, so the socius uh, would be um, pure objective, um, the pure objective implication of the other upon uh, just consciousness, because unconsciousness is not really a part of the phenomenology, because Husserl and Heidegger didn't treat the unconscious at all. Didn't talked about it, and Sartre just talked about it and said, "Okay, I'm not going to talk about it." So what was said in regards to phenomenology, like it's just consciousness. So the socius would be a pure conscious being, and in this paragraph, in their own reasoning, then the socius would be in this case the psychoanalytic society. So we're talking about the pure conscious being of psychoanalytic society. So if you are like purely conscious, then of course, and you can add, well, because they do this often, of course. They up till now, and they will do in the future, of course, because we already read the book. You can add the unconscious and play around with that a little bit, but to say, okay, so this consciousness of socius, psychoanalytic socius, does not affect the unconscious, goes against everything which is which is it goes against all the progress that we made, and
I don't know if that's true. I think let me try to say, because I think I know what. So it's not saying that the conscious doesn't affect the unconscious. Like it's saying that one produces the other. So saying that the conscious doesn't affect the unconscious, I'm not sure that is like the right wording I'd use, but that the unconscious produces the conscious.
Well, the societal conscious, right? So I'm not saying I'm not talking about cogito. I'm talking about conscious as the socius, the conscious of the socius. Maybe the law would be an example of that. Like a manifestation of the concept of the law, which can happen, of course, in institutions at times. Like, for example, literal, like criminology writes about people. Now, of course, I'm not talking about incest. Going to talk more than I actually want to about incest today. I'm not talking about it again, but like the law would be an example of consciousness, of social consciousness, and but the unconsciousness, they treat basically what, okay, the the fallacy, more or less, in this thinking is that for Deleuze-Guattari, in this section at least, they basically work with two sets of unconscious, and that's of course, like Guattari has this view, like he has possibly four sets of unconscious. So it is not, well, maybe not that strange a thought, but it's not explained in the book. So I think it's just in the book it doesn't really make sense. It is kind of it doesn't line up for me, and
I mean, it works for me. Works for me, but like I think we're reading it differently, which is what I like. Jack, you?
Well, but again, it doesn't line up phenomenologically, right? Because I know the paragraph you're referring to, and if I remember correctly, they're saying they don't say the socius is analogous to a conscious being. They say we're making a phenomenological point to make a case in point, but it's not meant to be. I don't think they're. I think they say something to the effect of, we're not trying to put this into phenomenology in a larger sense, right? We're not going to do a phenomenological analysis. We're just going to make a point here to prove a point. And so with the socius, like, and when they talk about the earth, I don't think they're talking about it as a conscious being, especially when they talk about the earth becoming a madhouse. And this is where I think it isn't really interesting. It is. I agree with you. There's influence from Sartre. He's cited in the notes, right? Particularly the critique of dialectical reason. Interestingly enough.
Oh, really? I didn't see the notes. I'm not sure if I have them by edition.
But
Don't
that would
think
be
I
the
have those.
thing, though.
Oh,
Deleuze and Guattari don't. I don't read this book as phenomenological. So when they're talking about the unconscious and its production, like at best you can talk about because this is hugely different from Sartre in that respect, right? For him, you have to work with the consciousness, kind of like you're saying, to solve all this. You have to work with intentionality, right? And that's where he's going to build his ethics. For Deleuze and Guattari, this is an ethics that's built into the production of the unconscious, right? And how it's interacted with. It's like the paralogisms in that, and the creation of like codification, right? There's an ethics in relation to how that affects the unconscious's production, but there's also an ethics in how the unconscious produces itself. Because for
yeah, yeah.
Deleuze and Guattari, we're always produced as a result of this, right? As a residuum, and we're produced as a collective subject, right? So this is the other thing. It's not even the unconscious that Sartre was
Right.
dealing with, because when he's and I've only read Transcendence of the Ego, but when he criticizes Freud and I believe it's Piaget, no, Janet, when he criticizes Freud and Janet, right, he's working with a very personal unconscious, right, that each
Hmm.
person has. Deleuze and Guattari don't have that confine. And that's a huge difference from early Sartre and probably his later work too.
Well, okay. Yeah.
Well, does anyone have any questions? That was way more complicated there. I like it. It's just like, I now have fucking questions because I don't know Sartre very well. Like, I can't even have this discussion.
I will say I
We
did
do have
enjoy
Nietzsche starting,
Transcendence of the
and
Ego.
so Ken's gone. We're finishing up here. Any last notes or comments, Bostgerd? Did you have a good time? All right, good. I'm gonna go ahead and close out the recording now, and we can continue talking. I just need I've got work to go do, so I'm glad we got through it. This works. Thank everyone for joining us today. This was great. This was fun. I like it.
I just wanted to say, for what it's worth, I did enjoy Transcendence of the Ego. It is a good essay. I just don't think it's what they're doing here.